Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So today we wanted to talk about version control. And this is a great collaboration tool. And therefore, the two of us who work by ourselves are going to tell you all about it.
Drawing on our vast experience about using version control with all the clever things you hear about with like Git, and you can have merging and branching strategies and rebasing and all the things that thankfully I never have to deal with because I tend to just work by myself and I'm collaborating with myself. And so thankfully things typically, and like merge conflicts, not a big problem for me, it turns out. But still, I think version control is a very important part of like the discipline of software engineering. And so it seemed like it was something that would be worth discussing, even if obviously, jokingly, some of the more collaborative parts of it aren't as relevant for us.
I mean, for me, like I have mostly the same situation in that I'm mostly collaborating with nobody. But there have been times where I've seen a lot of the value of it. For instance, I mean, I used to work at normal jobs where I had other people working with me, so we would do things there. But that was back in the Subversion days, and it was much simpler, and it was still very small teams. And these days, I mostly don't do any kind of collaboration. However, I do have a couple of open source projects that I run, and most of them get no activity whatsoever, but a few of them do get third-party contributions, and I have done, Git pull requests and merges and stuff like that, and those things, so I have minimal experience there, and you and I actually just started accidentally collaborating on something, and I don't think it's even worth mentioning what it is. It's a very, very narrow need that both of us happen to have, and almost nobody else does. I committed to your code base the other day, and that was like the first time I've ever committed to someone else's iOS code base. And and you said that was probably the first time that anyone's ever committed to yours, right?
It's been a very long time, since like 2011, 2012, I think was the last time I had any kind of collaboration. So yes, it is very much a rare thing, but it was kind of fun. Like I was like, oh, if someone else, it's like I have to do a fetch and a pull rather than just a push. This is novel and exciting.
Yeah, I don't know how I would deal with that in my apps. I'd probably fix all the style differences, which is like this huge faux pas to like restyle someone else's commit.
But like version control, like there is definitely collaboration is an important part of that, and there are lots of different ways to deal with that. Like obviously, like we're saying, for us, we don't do as much from a collaboration perspective, but I've worked in companies where it's an important thing, and there's lots of great mechanisms for this now. Like this is something that I think back to. I think my first version control system was CVS, I think.
Yep.
And then I went to Subversion and then to Git. And every time, like the tool itself gets better and less awkward and less cumbersome. And I think about the things that are even things like GitHub or Bitbucket, or there's lots of kind of these online backs or front ends for the repository, which makes so many of these things so helpful. And while I don't do a lot of it, whenever I've had to do something like that, where you have like you submit a pull request and you can have notes and code review, and a lot of these things are nice and clear and obvious rather than just kind of sitting there at the command line trying to work out what's going on when someone else submits code and it crashes into yours and things are horrible and broken. And so, you can do some pretty powerful things too. Like I remember back with my early days of version control where you would check out specific files that you were going to change. And things like that would be very cumbersome. And you'd be like, every now and then you'd go down the hall and, like ask Jim down the hall, hey, are you done with that header? Because I need to add something to it for my part of, of this app, and things like that, which, most modern version control systems can just deal with in terms of if you edit the top and he edits the bottom, it just goes and that's fine. And, that can sometimes be problematic if he's changing something in one way and you're changing it in another. But, by and large, collaboration is much easier from a version control perspective than it used to be, because you have these nice visual tools and mechanisms by which you can each share access into a repository.
Yeah, I mean it is so nice to have modern conveniences with these things and modern advancements. I mean, I never did the systems where checkouts are exclusive to one person, but just basics of like versioning and merging from all of these systems are great. And and especially like branching became a lot easier with Git and the DVCS model. And these things, I mean, it just helps so much when you're working on a team, and also when you're working by yourself. And I think that's what we're going to talk about too, is like, even when you're working alone, these systems provide invaluable help. And I think every developer, this is actually, I know that not every developer who works for themselves does version control, and I think not doing it is a huge mistake.
Yes, I don't even know how. I mean, that just seems like that's like the wild, wild west, where like, are you like copying folders like anytime, like it's when you have like version 1, version 2, version 3, like, oh, that's chilling. Yes, use version control, whatever it is. It doesn't like, it's one of these, it doesn't really matter which one you choose. Like if you're a Git person, a Mercurial person, if you want to use Subversion, if you want to do something else, like that's fine, but you have to use something. Because I think that's like the thing that you also can keep in mind with version control is like, it's a powerful like development tool, like in the way that you and I, like we probably spend most of our development time in Xcode or in some ways in some like TextMate or something, if we're doing, like web programming. But the tool of version control is a pretty powerful one in terms of it being a part of your development process and allowing you to do things that would otherwise be really awkward. Like I love in Git having lightweight branching, of being able to be like, I have this idea for a way to kind of restructure something or do a big refactor or take some code and take it in a different direction. And I can just branch off from like my main thing, try it for, a few days. And if I end up, it turns out to be just this complete dead end, I can sort of just like throw that away and go back to where I started from in a way that is nice and clean and reliable and isn't going to break something. Or if I want to just like cherry pick part of that I can do that in a controlled way. And also just to look at what I've been doing. Like sometimes it's being able to look at like in some ways you'd think like the blame part of version control if you work by yourself. And if you're not familiar, like blame in most version control systems, you can look at any line of code and see who created it and when that was created in the history of your project. And so this is the classic, like if someone breaks the build, you can run blame on it and see who broke it. But even for myself, like when the names are always me, it's often really helpful to be able to look back and be like, why am I doing this way? And I can go back and see like, interesting. I added this as, at 2 years ago when I was working on X feature. And that's often really, really, really helpful, to be able to look back and to understand my own code even better. And, even more so if you're collaborating with someone else. And even just to be able to, like, one thing I always do in my development cycle is I take the last commit that, like the version that I just released, and whenever I'm getting ready to submit to the App Store, like the very last step before I hit like actual archive and submit to the App Store, is I always go and run a diff between the last submitted version and my current version of the code. And I just go through like sort of line by line in all the changes and make sure that there's nothing in there that jumps out at me as like, whoa, why is this still in here? Or like, that doesn't seem right. And I've caught several bugs in my in my process that way by using version control as a tool to help me write better code.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest value of it as independent is that it's giving you a tool that can show you what you've changed and when you changed it and possibly why you changed it. But that's like just knowing what has changed, whether it's what did I do today to this one file so I know whether to even commit this change or not, or what has changed in the entire app between this version, which I know worked in this way, and the current version, which keeps having this weird bug that I can't figure out why it's happening. You can go and you can see, like, all right, well, here's everything that's different between these two. So the bug is because of some part of this, and like it's so useful to know that stuff. Everyone can get value out of that. It helps. It helps even if you have to work on multiple computers, or if you're working on, like if you have a deployment on your server and one locally on your computers, you keep those synced up properly in a sane way. I mean, it's just so great. I'm shocked that anybody still doesn't use it, but fortunately, most people do use it. I think most people have come around to it now, so we're mostly sane in that way. In an industry that's insane in so many other ways, we're mostly sane in that way.
Yeah, and it really helps in that regard that it's also become so much easier to do. Like I think of in Xcode, like it has like full on version control built into it. Like in terms of not even like its weird snapshotting thing that it always asks me when I'm refactoring a project, and then it asks me, do I want to make a snapshot? And I don't really know what that means, and I really don't think I do. But it has it built in. Like all of my projects, whenever I'm changing something, like it's really helpful in Xcode to just see what's changed. And like once I change something, it gets a little M icon next to it that says it's modified, or if I've added a file to it, it's there. And so like there's no reason not to be aware of this type of thing, because the tooling is in place to make that just so easy and streamlined that like you'd be a fool not to.
Yeah, and whether you do it on a hosted service like GitHub or Bitbucket, or whether you do it just locally, like you can almost all these systems you can have a local server if you want to, and not have it synced to any like remote/paid web service. But I recommend if you can swing it for regulatory reasons and for money reasons, I recommend just putting it on GitHub or Bitbucket, like put it on one of the big hosts, because it outsources a class of problems that you don't need to deal with anymore, and also you get a whole lot of convenience for having that be on a hosted system. You have the nice web GUIs, you have the ability to access it from anywhere, multiple computers, you have kind of this built-in backup. So it's, definitely host it if you can, and please use version control.
Yeah, and that gets into, I think, another kind of interesting aspect to version control, which is the backup portion of it.
Yeah.
Like both in terms of like what you're saying, where like it's another physical backup, like in the same way that you should have probably a clone of your main development hard drive running all the time, and like backup in that sense of like being able to, not have, if my computer dies, that suddenly like I'm out of luck and that's it. Like the only copy of, my code was sitting on that machine. Like that's terrifying. Like you have to have it backed up in a lot of ways, because like the funny thing about doing the kind of work we do, like there's no sort of tangible, the only tangible outcome of our work is like a collection of like text files and images sitting on our hard drive. And so like the amount of time and energy and money that goes into creating those, we have to treat them like incredibly carefully. Like if we were at Coca-Cola and we have to keep, I imagine like the recipe for Coca-Cola is very well protected and backed up and guarded to make sure that they can keep making it. Because if somehow like it got lost and they didn't know the recipe anymore, that would be hugely problematic. And so as developers, like our source code is that thing. Like even if we have a binary, an old binary of our app, like that doesn't do us any good. We can't change that. And so it's important to back it up, both in terms of that kind of backup. And then something else that I've found it so helpful for many times too, is it's having this, like being able to go through, so it's like you have this little time machine that you can go back in time and say, what was my app like at a particular time? And like you were saying earlier, this is great for identifying like weird regressions and bugs where it's like it worked in version 2, but it doesn't work in version 3. Like, why is that? And you can actually go back, and what I'll often end up doing is, I'll export the project from my version control at a particular, milestone, and change the bundle identifier, and I can run them both at the same time, and I can kind of go back and forth, and I can see why things are different. And that kind of snapshotting is really helpful to be able to look back. And then even one other thing that it's kind of more silly, but I love sometimes being able to go back to like version 1 of a product after it becomes very mature, both to kind of laugh at myself and just kind of look at it, but also just to kind of for nostalgia reasons of kind of looking at it. And it's kind of nice to have a sense of like, wow, I've really come a long way. This app used to be so simple, and now it's so much more robust. And that's kind of fun to have this backup of it that sort of never goes away in that way. Like I always this is why I also version control all my screenshots that I submit to the App Store.
Yep, me too.
Like they're in there for that same reason, that sometimes is really fun or useful, or like I'm doing a retrospective post, an app has, when one of my apps hits a milestone, like it's been, it's 5 years old. Like if it's, hitting a milestone, it's kind of fun to like do a blog post or something like that to kind of talk about it and show screenshots or the icon from a long time ago. Like version control is a great place to keep those things. So it's all in the same place, and it, as time marches on, you can keep a nice accurate record of what's changed.
All right, our sponsor this week is Braintree. Braintree is code for easy online payments. They are a full stack payment platform. And, why make payment integration more difficult than it has to be? Braintree allows you to accept nearly any type of payment from any device with just one integration. They support PayPal, Bitcoin, Venmo, Apple Pay, Android Pay, cards, and they will support whatever's next, all with that one integration. It's flexible to your system's needs and supports most programming languages. So whether you're using Java, Ruby, or Python, you will always have a range of server-side and client-side SDKs available. The Braintree client code supports Android, iOS, and JavaScript, and all this takes just 10 lines of code to implement. Braintree makes payments and your job a whole lot easier. Learn more at braintreepayments.com/radar. Once again, that's braintreepayments.com/radar. Thank you very much to Braintree for sponsoring our show and all of Relay FM.
So I think what might make sense for the rest of the episode is to kind of talk about how this actually, what we do in practice, like what the actual tools that we use, what that goes around. Because I think there's certainly a degree to which version control can become a very personal thing. And some people like Mercurial, some people like Git, some people maybe even still love Subversion, or there's something new and fancier that I'm not aware of. But you end up with these kind of preferences. And at least I know for myself, I have kind of workflows and things that I've built up over time that are part of this, that maybe are helpful, or if you're looking for a different way of doing Git or different tools for it, might be helpful to discuss. So what is your typical, how do you actually interact with your version control system?
So on the server, I just do it all via command line, and I use Git, and I host on GitHub, which I would imagine GitHub is probably one of the biggest reasons why people choose Git and why it's so popular, because GitHub is just so convenient in many ways and so good in many ways. And it isn't perfect, but it's very good. I use GitHub, again, private everything. I pay for it. It's fine. It's been very secure for me and totally fine. And honestly, if somebody steals my source code somehow, I don't really worry about that, because source code is not very valuable. If you get somebody's source code to their entire app, what are you going to do with that? You can upload it, but that's illegal, and they can easily get it taken down. So, you can make your own app, again, also illegal from that. They get it taken down. So, the actual value of stolen source code isn't particularly high for somebody's random iOS app. So, anyway, back to how I use it. I use the command line for almost everything I do in general in development. So MySQL, I use the command line interface to that. If I'm doing development with other server-side daemons like Memcache or Redis, I will use the command line to interface with those, to set them up, to do administrative tasks if I need to ever. Git, I usually don't do that anymore. With Git is so complicated on the command line and so tedious on the command line that I usually just use Git Tower as my GUI, which is it's a Mac app. It's some price. It doesn't matter. It's worth whatever price they charge. It's worth it. I think it's like $50. Whatever it is, totally worth it. Because Git is incredibly complicated, and it doesn't need to be. In most use, you can get by, and it's totally fine, and you'll be fine. But sometimes you have to do something crazy with it, or you have a weird error that you have to overcome. And anything involving branching, merging of branches, certain advanced operations like committing only part of what you've changed, or discarding only part of what you've changed, you can do all these things in the command line, but it's so obtuse to figure out how to do that on Git. And many times these things can be multiple commands. And many times they're very error prone if you do them manually, and you could actually do some damage if you do it wrong. So typically now I just use Git Tower on the Mac, and I just don't do any kind of operations like that on the server.
I'm exactly the same. I use Git Tower for probably 99% of my Git. It just it works. It's very reliable. It's straightforward, and the way that they present Git, I've always found seem kind of works with my head. Sometimes I've tried some other Git clients and they can get very, they're showing me too much. Git has all kinds of crazy information and metadata and things about, especially when you have lots of branches, things that are going on, and they just hurt my head. And I liken the way that I use Git Tower, it's pretty straightforward. I open it up, I open a repository. It's here's the things that you've changed, and would you like to commit them? And that's like most of my process is that. And if I want to make a branch, I just like pick the commit I want to branch from, I give it a name, and now it's created. And so it does a very good job of showing that to me in a way that, yeah, it's like, it's completely, it's one of those essential tools. Like if I'm setting up a new computer, there's like in that first like 5 things that I will download onto it. One of them is going to be Git Tower, because I really can't work productively without it, which is probably saying a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I really do try to avoid GUI tools for developer stuff where there is a perfectly suitable command line version. But this is one of those things where it's so worth it. It is so, not only does it save me a lot of time and it makes certain operations, less error prone that are complex, but also it just gives me a really good view of what's going on. Like, most of what we mentioned before, like a lot of what we were talking about is like how source control can show you and help you track what you're changing, what has changed over time, how things used to be or how things are now. And Git Tower they just do a really nice job of showing the diffs, showing the various commits and what was in each commit, showing branches and letting you do that. And it isn't, I mean, there's certainly room for improvement. In particular, I think the submodule area could use some improvement, but that's most of the areas that I think Tower could be improved, including submodules, I think are at least partially or even mostly because the underlying Git feature is itself complicated and finicky. So like submodules suck. Everything about Git submodules is horrible. And so I can understand why the implementation of them in Tower is also a little bit odd and a little bit finicky. But ultimately, I think if I'm going to be using Git, this is the way to do it.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think it's also probably worth contrasting it to, I do use the version control integration in Xcode quite a bit, but it's for like totally different things.
Like what?
Like I use it's just useful to be able to see what's changed. And often what I'll end up doing is if in the, what's it called? The navigator view, like the bottom left part of the Xcode browser, you can say like, show me only files that have changed, that have like an active version control status. And that's really helpful. Often I'll find when I'm like working on something and I can kind of just see the files that are sort of I've been working on, and it collapses a big project into a nice small list. And it's also kind of just, if I see something that doesn't look right, like often I'll find like a nib file that has changed for some reason that I don't understand. Like I opened it up once and touched it, and then horrible things happen, and being able to be aware of that earlier in the process is helpful. But most of what I do is they're very helpful, like version control. I'm sure these have fancy names, but like where you can compare inside of Xcode your current version to a past version. So it's like if you're in the top right corner of Xcode, there's like the 3 views. There's like the regular view, the companion view, and then the version control view. And in that, I'm so often in there when I'm like looking at code and trying to see like, well, what's changed? How is this different? How did I used to do this? Like if I have a problem that I've solved once before, I go in there and compare them. And then like I was saying earlier, I surprisingly often for working just myself, I'll use blame. So I'll switch it into blame mode and look through the source file and say like, when did this change? When did I start doing it this way? What was that around? And those kinds of tools, and having them like built right in to Xcode is really useful. Like I go to Tower regularly, but it's when I'm done with something or when I'm getting ready to do a release or like in these kind of big strategic operations. But I love that Xcode has integration at the tactical level where like I'm actively coding, and in that process, I don't have to context switch to some other app to like look this up. I can very easily just be like, why am I doing it this way? When did this change? And that sort of thing. And so I use those tools in Xcode a lot. But I hardly ever commit or any of those types of operations, from Xcode. It has them, like I'm sure they're there, and I'm glad they exist in some ways, so that like out of the box you can do basic version control. But in Xcode, I find it really helpful at that like basic, like the actual line of code level, and then I go to Tower whenever I want to do like actual operations, like things that I would go to a command line and type, git clone, git branch, git merge, git whatever. I don't actually know what half of them are because I just use Tower instead.
So I didn't even know this version view was here. I just open it up now, and I'm like, my mind is blown. Like, oh my god, this is so useful.
So someone has not been watching what's new in developer tools sessions at WWDC for the last few years. I think we just discovered that live on air.
Does that surprise anybody? I didn't read the manual. This is great. This
is amazing.
All I ever really used in Xcode was the little M indicators on the sidebar to know what I've changed.
Well, there you go. Now you know that you can do some of these basic operations live at Xcode, and like I said, they're really helpful. They're not.
Turns out. All right. Anything else this week?
No, I think that's it. Mostly, I guess, just to say, make sure you're using version control. Please, please, please make sure you're using version control. It's one of those things that if you're not, and version everything. Like I version stuff like I don't do a lot of like Photoshop work, but when I do, like I just put my PSDs into version control.
Oh yeah.
And it doesn't do all the cool fancy diffing. It's not fancy in that way, but like I don't care. I can always go back in time. I can always snapshot things. Like whatever you're doing, try and version control it. Like I version control my blog. I version control anything I can, because once you get into the discipline and the habit of doing it, like it's just so much better. And it's probably worth saying I'm terrible about commit messages because I'm just working by myself, and it's hilarious. Like most of my commit messages are often just like stuff kind of works now.
Yeah.
This seems to be better.
Fix.
But that's enough. Like because I'm still creating snapshots. Like I'm not necessarily communicating as well to my future self, which is maybe, like problematic to, in some ways, but just having it, like just putting random gibberish in there, and just like, you'd be better off if you just like had Git take a commit snapshot once an hour, would be, even if you didn't want to do anything, like having just some kind of resource to be able to go back in time is so valuable. And I think can make you such a better developer, especially when you use the Xcode integration tools, to understand
watch the videos.
If you watch the videos, you can really do some powerful things. So I highly recommend them.
All right. Thanks a lot. That's all the time we have this week. So thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks to our sponsor, Braintree. And we will see you next week.
Bye. I can't believe you didn't know those were there. How did you not know those were there?
There's a lot of Xcode I haven't explored yet.
Like there's only like in the default nav bar, like there's only like 6 buttons.
I just never click on those two. Yeah, the one next to it with the semicircles, the Venn diagram one, the assistant editor. I don't know what that does either.
Well, that one is mostly just like useful for if you have a nib in one view and like the related file in the other one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Like it's designed to have 2 things compared to like next to each other. So that's useful if you're like dragging outlets or things, from if you're dragging outlets from a nib file into a source file. I use the companion one. But yeah. No, there's this whole world of version control that's been waiting for you this whole time. Oh, I'm so glad we captured that on.